Tradition and modernity, a battle that will never cease. Do we cling fervently to the past and to traditional values and beliefs? Or do we let go of the past and rush into the future with bright aspirations and ambitions? Though we like to believe the future will be brighter than our past, there are those who recognize that tradition has its place and the past holds truths that we would be wise to never forget. If there's one lesson my channel must teach you before it fades away, it is this. History has much to teach us, and the Warlord is a hero who understands us more than most. Simple, straightforward, but immovable and unstoppable. Warlord is a hero who for the longest time I felt was in dire need of help and updating in For Honor. As new heroes are added and old heroes go through drastic changes, he's one of the few who has seen almost no alterations since his release. I at first thought this a bad thing, but the more I looked into him, understood what it is based on and what he represents, perhaps he doesn't need changing. So who is he based on? What is the Warlord in For Honor? Let's talk about it. Welcome back to Heroes in History, where we take a look at all of For Honor's heroes and decide who they're based on and whether or not they do their counterparts justice. And today, we take a look at the last one of the Vikings so far, and also the last of the original cast of characters, Warlord. Warlord was a difficult one to pin down, because to understand Warlord, you must understand his character in-game. Warlords are Viking leaders who are not chosen based on birthright or hereditary successions. They are chosen by their earned position. They have to earn their place. They have to deserve it.
They are called Warlords, a name that is earned, another ancient tradition.
They wield a shield and sword, but they make it clear that the sword they wield is lethal. And believe me, that is a relevant point.
Their swords are as lethal, simple, and ancient design.
The shield they use is a round center grip shield, which is the standard Viking shield, and they also are considered defenders of their people, unwilling to break or yield as they are considered important to the Viking people and clans. All of this provided me the clues I needed to do my research.
To become a warlord means service to all who need it, for life. They are the shield of our people, and they will not fall.
Firstly, it's important to understand Viking social structure. The Viking society was divided into three social classes. The thralls, who were the slaves of Viking society, were the lowest class. There were several ways one became a thrall. Some were captured as prisoners of war, others were kidnapped from raids, such as several Christian women and children during raids on Christian lands in Western Europe. Some were born into the class by their families, and others were those who had broken laws or incurred significant debt. Most Viking households could hold up to 2 thralls at a time. Fortunately, the practice faded after the 11th century and the rise of Christendom pushed for the abolishment of thraldom, and it was eventually outlawed by the 14th century. Above the thralls were the carls, or freemen. Carls made up the majority of Viking society. They were the working class. They were sailors, fishers, blacksmiths, tailors, warriors, and farmers. And unlike samurai class structure, where the common man was forbidden from carrying weapons, almost all carls were permitted and encouraged to carry a weapon around with them. Most wore axes or short daggers, but more prominent and wealthy families might carry a sword around. Carls also were warriors too, and some carls who were poor and had little money to feed their families would volunteer on raids or become Vikings so they could raid for slaves, silver, or booty with which to make a living. Many felt that, by living as Vikings, they could make themselves rich and pull themselves out of poverty. But finally, the highest social class, and the one that we really want to focus on, is the Jarl. Jarls were Viking noblemen and landowners with a lot of personal property and privilege. They were wealthy, strong, and respected individuals. They were the equivalent of feudal lords and landholders in most cases, and would later be called earls by the United Kingdom. Jarls ruled in the stead of petty kings and sovereigns, and were often left in charge of territories or holdings in place of a king. Jarls didn't have absolute power in all things, mind you, and could be answerable to a king. They also could sometimes rule in a place of a king if there was no king in power and no one was being chosen at the time. A Jarl was usually chosen by the king to rule these territories, and they were usually chosen for their loyalty, their ability to lead, and perhaps their battle honors. For example, the only Jarl in Iceland that we know of was Gissur Thorvaldsson, who was instrumental in bringing Iceland under Norwegian rule during the Age of Stirlings. Now, As the days of Viking and Norse culture began to fade, the term Jarl became interchangeable in Norway with the term Duke. In 1237, Jarl Skirl Bardsson was the first Jarl to be granted the title of Duke, and it meant that a Jarl was no longer the highest rank one could be under the king, as Duke was now the highest, thus making the title lesser in value. The last time there would ever be a Jarl to hold the title in Norway was in 1295, showing you how quick that title began to just fade from memory. Now, this was the way Viking society functioned during the Golden Age of Vikings, and we do need to keep it in mind, but there's more that I want to talk about. This isn't how it all began. Around the 2nd century, because keep in mind, all that we've talked about up till now is somewhere around the 11th to 13th century. Around the 2nd century, Scandinavian society centered around warlords called Drots. Drots were powerful warriors who stood out from other warriors, and so the Viking societies gathered around them and looked to them as leaders, pledging loyalty to them. Now, the position of Drot was not inherited, it was an earned title. You don't just get born into it. One was not simply born a Drot. They were different from a typical king, as they had limited power in peacetime, but during times of war were looked to over king. So the idea is, when peace is going on, everyone loves the king. But when it's time to go to war, the king is overlooked and people focus on the Drot. This would begin to change leading up to the 9th century, as Scandinavian kings and Drots would fight for power and political position. Because as you know, if you're king, you don't like to share power with anybody, even ones that have military position. Now, this conflict would lead to the development of dynastic regional kings that competed with the Drots and Warlords in the 11th century. If a warlord became too powerful or too dangerous, they could be assassinated and replaced, and that suited the kings just fine. The kings, now having more absolute power, were still mostly chosen by meritocracy than by succession. Although as marriage proposals and trade grew more prominent in Viking society, the need for stability and dynastic leadership became essential. Because after all, if you keep having to choose every king based on merit, then after a while, you lose stability. One king may have different laws than the last king, different ideals than the last king. It becomes difficult to maintain a society with stability. So eventually they decided, you know what, screw that, we'll just have a dynastic ruling system, which means that the child of the king would become the next king, on and on and on. However, Jarls could be chosen based on merit or by the king's pleasure, meaning that the old traditions of Drots and Warlords had not totally diminished. It is for this reason that I believe the Warlord and For Honor is heavily based on the Jarl class in Viking society, and not just the Jarls, but the Drots specifically. The armor and weapons the Warlord carries signify he is most likely based on the 11th century period of Viking culture, when Drots were mostly no longer active, but his adherence to tradition ties him very closely to what the Drots were. As said in the trailer, the title of Warlord is one that is earned, not handed out, and Drots also earned their position.
They are called Warlords, a name that is earned, another ancient tradition.
As leaders and defenders of their people, they have much in common with Jarls and Drots. But something I think is very interesting to consider outside of just their role in Viking society is their weapon, their sword. Now you might think, well, what's so special about a sword and shield? Wouldn't that be standard issue for a Viking? Actually, no. The sword and shield combo is kind of neat. It's actually a bit uncommon. See, steel in Scandinavian lands was not high in carbon, and many of the swords found on Vikings were of poor quality. During most grave digging sites where we found Viking swords, many of the swords were not very good. They were not of high quality. So likely, swords were most likely just status symbols. They were probably expensive, but still mostly just to show off. However, Jarls and high-ranking Vikings with a lot of money and influence could potentially afford swords made in foreign lands, like the Frankish Ulfbert sword, which was much higher carbon make and far more useful. And it looks a lot like what the Warlord uses. In fact, most wealthy Vikings could have swords that were more ornate or beautiful, not unlike some of the sword designs of Warlord sword. Since swords were a status symbol, that indicates the Warlord was of a high position or high station, further adding to the idea that they are Jarls. I would also point to the trailer again, where he says that a leader who does not lead the charge is no leader at all.
And a leader who does not lead the charge is no leader at all.
This is actually a unique aspect of leadership that identifies him not as a king, but more of a military leader, someone who people will follow into battle, not someone who commands others to go into battle in his stead, which ties into the idea that the Drot were people that others flocked to. Because of the way their swords are used in battle and the level of armor they are using, the Warlord are certainly the 11th century era Vikings. But their passion, the way in which their title is an earned position rather than a simple societal class, implies they are Jarls who are treated as Draught. It should be noted that in a world like the For Honor world, where perpetual war is a state of life for everyone, it makes a lot of sense that the ancient ways of Draught leadership or Warlord leadership would stay alive and well, as the people require military commanders far more than mere petty kings. A king cannot defend the people from his palace as well as a Draught who runs headfirst into the battlefield ready to defend those who need defending. Now, the playstyle of the Warlord, above all, is sturdy. He's one of the only warriors without a dodge attack, yet anyway, and he is renowned for his defense and counterattack techniques. His hyper armor is his claim to fame, and his charging ability allows him to maneuver himself and his opponent to an optimal position for fighting. But he does not flee. He does not dodge and weave about needlessly. He stands his ground. He holds the line, never breaks or falters, or at least, I guess, the way I play him. When I play Warlord, I find that I have a tendency to stay still, staunch and unbreakable, and that, down to its core, is the key to Warlord as a character and understanding his origins. Tradition. The old ways of war pulsate through Warlord like lifeblood. He stands firm in his ways and past understanding. He's not a young man. He's aged and he's worn. But with that age comes a tenacious desire to see the things he loves preserved. One cannot run into the future without respecting what was used to build that path. And that path was built using the discoveries, battles, losses, victories, and sacrifices of our ancestors. One of the things that I think is very important about Warlord, above almost every other hero, is the fact that he represents the old, tried, and true. You know, we see Pirate coming into the game with a gun and new ways of fighting and firearms. We see the Knights with their updated armor and cooler looks and fancy weaponry. We see the Samurai coming in with new tactics, these traditional values that are stemmed in new honorifics and all. But the Vikings, especially the Warlord, many people would say are the savages. They're the ones who are too old hat. They're the old-fashioned ones. People keep saying we need to update Warlord and all the others with plate mail armor. Give them a firearm. Give them a modern equivalent of something. But I'm like, I think people miss the point of why I like the Vikings so much. As I said in the beginning, and as I try to make clear in my channel with every new video, history matters. Our past matters. We learn far more from our ancestors and their deeds than we care to admit. And Warlord might be one of the most simplistic heroes in For Honor, but it is because he is a reminder and testament to where we all began, where we all have come from. Warlord, as well as most of the Vikings, but Warlord in particular, represents something that we sometimes forget. Even when we didn't have guns, even when we didn't have plate mail armor, even when we didn't have the best, fanciest weaponry, crossbows, or what have you, there was a necessity for people like Warlord, people like Jarls, people like Draught. Warriors who picked up sword and shield and dared to defend a civilization that needed people prepared to go to war. For it so happens that in the course of human history, when society builds up what is good and just, it will call upon the strong to stand firm and protect the architects of civilization. This is the tradition that is deeper than stone and will carry on into the future. If you watch Warlord's trailer, he talks a lot about tradition, values, purpose. There's a reason for that. Some would say he's just the stereotype Viking, just your stereotype. But I don't see stereotype. I see grounded. I see something that a lot of us, for better or worse, tend to overlook. And I'm thankful that Warlord's on the cast. I'm thankful that Warlord is the way he is. Because he reminded me, even if just for a moment, there was a time I saw a lot of myself in Warlord. And the best thing about the Warlord is what he says at the end of his trailer.
To become a warlord means service to all who need it. For life, they are the shield of our people. And they will not fall.
As long as traditions never fall, then society will continue to improve into the future. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in my next one. Take care.